In the winter of 1944, a German tank gunner named Fritz Ensslin found himself in the strangest situation of his entire military career. He was standing inside a prisoner of war camp at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and he was eating ice cream. For years, Ensslin had slept either inside or on top of his tank. He had fought through the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front where temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. He had watched friends die for lack of medical supplies. He had gone hungry when rations failed to reach the front lines. Now here he stood in an American prison camp that felt like a luxury hotel. The beds had clean sheets. The food was plentiful and served 3 times daily. Guards treated prisoners with unexpected decency, even friendliness. Ensslin later recalled his experience with words that captured something essential about the war. "We had the feeling of being in a Hilton hotel," he said. For years we had been sleeping either inside or on top of our tanks. He and his fellow prisoners joked among themselves that if they had known they would be treated this way, they would have found a way to surrender earlier instead of fighting until they ran out of ammunition. This was not an isolated sentiment among German prisoners. Another captured soldier named Gunter Grawe remembered a specific moment from August or September of 1944 that crystallized his understanding of the war. He stood in front of a shop inside his American prison camp considering what to purchase first. Ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola. The last ice cream he had been able to buy in Germany was years ago. Coca-Cola he had never tasted in his entire life. After a moment of deliberation, he decided to take both. And in that moment of ordinary consumer choice, he suddenly realized how extremely lucky he had been to be captured by the American army and not the Russian one. Grawe was so moved by this experience that decades later, in 2016 at the age of 91, he returned to Fort Lewis in America to personally express his gratitude. He wanted to thank the country that had treated him with humanity during his captivity, when it had every reason to treat him harshly as an enemy combatant. These were not exceptional cases. Across the crumbling Third Reich in 1945, German soldiers made a calculation that profoundly shaped the war's final months. They would fight desperately to escape westward. They would endure any hardship and accept any risk to avoid Soviet capture. Because they understood something fundamental about the two vastly different enemies they faced. The Soviets would destroy them with sheer numbers and brutal determination, with an apparently inexhaustible supply of men willing to die. But the Americans would destroy them with something far more terrifying in its long-term implications. The Americans would bury them under an avalanche of material abundance that defied everything Germans thought they knew about how wars were fought and won. The statistical evidence tells a stark and unambiguous story about the Eastern Front. Approximately 80% of German military deaths occurred fighting the Soviets. According to historian Rüdiger Overmans, whose comprehensive study remains the authoritative source, roughly 4 million German soldiers perished in the East, out of approximately 5.3 million total German war dead. The Soviets inflicted catastrophic and sustained losses on the Wehrmacht year after year from 1941 through 1945. Yet when German veterans and generals reflected on their enemies in memoirs and post-war interviews, a curious and revealing pattern emerged. They spoke of the Soviets with a mixture of fear and grudging professional respect for their willingness to absorb punishment that would have shattered Western armies. But they spoke of American logistics with something closer to philosophical awe and resignation. They recognized that Soviet numbers could theoretically be matched with superior tactics and operational skill. German units consistently inflicted disproportionate casualties on Soviet forces throughout the entire war. But American logistics represented something entirely different in kind. It represented an enemy that could not be outfought because the tactical fight itself was irrelevant to the strategic outcome. This is the story of why German soldiers came to respect American supply lines more than Soviet numbers. It is a story about what happens when the full might of industrial civilization wages total war against nations that have not yet fully grasped the revolutionary implications of industrial age warfare. And it is a story that changed how military professionals think about the relationship between combat power and logistical capacity. The German army that invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, was the most experienced and tactically proficient military force on Earth. Operation Barbarossa deployed over 3 million soldiers along an 1,800-mile front in the largest military operation in recorded history. German commanders confidently expected a swift and decisive victory. They had crushed Poland in 5 weeks. France had fallen in 6 weeks, despite possessing one of Europe's largest and theoretically most powerful armies. The Soviet Union, with its recently purged officer corps and seemingly primitive military organization, would surely collapse even more quickly. Hitler himself predicted the entire campaign would require no more than 3 months. What German military intelligence catastrophically failed to understand was the true depth of Soviet reserves and mobilization capacity. Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff and one of the architects of Barbarossa, recorded a deeply disturbing observation in his war diary on August 11, 1941. German planners had expected to fight approximately 200 Soviet divisions over the entire course of the campaign. By August 11th, barely 7 weeks into the invasion, they had already positively identified 360 Soviet divisions. The Red Army was producing new formations faster than German forces could destroy existing ones. Men and equipment materialized from the vast interior of the Soviet Union in quantities that defied German expectations and planning assumptions. By early December of 1941, Halder wrote confidently in his diary that the enemy had finally reached their limits. They had exhausted their reserves and had no more forces at their disposal. The Soviet military was spent, and Germany stood on the very brink of final victory. Moscow would fall within days. 3 days after Halder wrote those optimistic words, the Soviets launched a devastating winter counteroffensive that drove the Germans back from Moscow in disarray. More than 1 million fresh Soviet troops attacked along a front of over 500 miles. German forces that had been within sight of the Kremlin's golden spires were thrown back up to 200 miles in some sectors. The myth of German invincibility was shattered in the snow outside Moscow. The pattern that would define the entire Eastern Front for the next 3.5 years had been established. Germany would achieve tactical victories. German units would destroy Soviet formations at impressive kill ratios. And then more Soviet formations would appear from the endless Russian interior. The scale of Soviet military operations grew increasingly devastating as the war progressed. Operation Bagration in June and July of 1944 demonstrated what the Red Army had learned about conducting offensive warfare. The Soviets concentrated between 2.3 and 2.5 million troops against German Army Group Center, which defended with fewer than 500,000 men. At breakthrough points, Soviet forces achieved advantages of 10-1 in tanks and 7-1 in aircraft. The result was catastrophic for Germany. 28 of 34 German divisions were completely destroyed. Between 300,000 and 450,000 German soldiers became casualties. On July 17, 1944, approximately 57,000 German prisoners were paraded through the streets of Moscow in a deliberate display of Soviet triumph. The prisoners included 19 captured generals marching in their full-dress uniforms at the head of the column. The cumulative casualty figures from the Eastern Front were staggering beyond human comprehension. Soviet military deaths reached somewhere between 8.7 million and 11 million soldiers, depending on which scholarly methodology is accepted. The lower figure comes from official Russian government statistics compiled by General Grigory Krivoshev. The higher estimate comes from independent Russian historian Mikhail Meltyukov. Total Soviet deaths, including civilians, approached 27 million people. To grasp this scale, 27 million dead exceeded the entire pre-war population of many European nations. The Soviet Union lost more people in the Second World War than the combined populations of Australia, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The Eastern Front consumed human lives on a mechanized industrial scale that had never been witnessed before in the entire history of warfare. German soldiers who survived this grinding meat grinder described their experiences in apocalyptic and often haunted terms. Guy Sager served in the elite Grossdeutschland division from 1942 through the war's chaotic end. His memoir, The Forgotten Soldier, describes endless artillery barrages that could last for hours or even days at a time. He writes of waves of Soviet infantry that seemed immune to fear, advancing through concentrated machine gun fire and artillery explosions as if death itself held no meaning for them. Historians have debated certain details in Sager's account, noting some factual inconsistencies in dates and unit designations. But the emotional truth of his descriptions resonated with other veterans who confirmed the psychological experience he portrayed. The memoir ends with Sager captured by the British, who release him upon learning he is actually French by birth. The implicit contrast between the existential terror of Russia and the comparatively civilized Western capture experience runs powerfully through his entire account. Gottlob Biedermann of the 132nd Infantry Division was wounded 5 separate times on the Eastern Front, over more than 1,000 days of combat against Soviet forces. The renowned military historian David Glantz, the foremost English-language expert on the Eastern Front, praised Biedermann's memoir In Deadly Combat as the book that stands head and shoulders above the many other books in this genre. Biedermann's account contains a passage that captures what German soldiers grimly understood about their situation. He wrote that it was widely accepted within the ranks of those fighting in the East that death on the battlefield was preferable to an unknown destiny in a Soviet prisoner of war camp. This was not paranoia or wartime propaganda. It was cold mathematical calculation based on known and documented facts. Of the approximately 91,000 Germans who surrendered at Stalingrad in February 1943, only around 6,000 ever returned home to Germany. That represents a death rate exceeding 93%. Soviet prison camps killed more than half of all German prisoners they held through a deliberate combination of starvation, epidemic disease, brutal working conditions, inadequate shelter, and systematic neglect. The contrast with American captivity could not possibly have been more extreme. German prisoners in American camps received adequate food prepared to reasonable standards, competent medical care, and were generally treated according to the established provisions of the Geneva Convention. The survival rate for German prisoners held by Western allies exceeded 99%. American camps even provided recreational facilities, educational programs, and opportunities for prisoners to earn small wages through voluntary work details. The ice cream and Coca-Cola that Gunter Grawe enjoyed would have been unimaginable luxuries to Germans who had experienced or even heard reliable accounts about Soviet captivity. This disparity in treatment shaped German strategic calculations in the war's final months, as soldiers and entire units maneuvered desperately to surrender westward rather than face capture by Soviet forces advancing from the east. The Eastern Front was undeniably hell, but it was a familiar kind of hell to military professionals who had studied history and understood the nature of attritional warfare. It was fundamentally a war of attrition where numbers ultimately trumped skill regardless of tactical excellence at the unit level. German officers understood this brutal dynamic intellectually, even as they struggled heroically against it on every battlefield. What they did not understand, what they simply could not have anticipated or prepared for, was the entirely different kind of war that was simultaneously approaching from the West. This was not a war of attrition in any traditional sense. This was something new in military history. The American military that landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, operated on organizational and logistical principles that seemed almost alien to traditional European military experience. The United States Army planned to deliver approximately 45 pounds of supplies per soldier per day to troops fighting overseas. This official planning figure included food at roughly 6 pounds per soldier daily. It included fuel at nearly 11 pounds. It included ammunition at almost 10 pounds. It included clothing and uniform replacements, spare equipment parts, medical supplies, and construction materials for building everything from roads to hospitals. During active offensive operations when consumption spiked dramatically, actual supply usage often exceeded 100 pounds per man per day. An American infantry division engaged in sustained combat consumed roughly 750 tons of supplies every single day without interruption. To put these astronomical figures in meaningful perspective, German logistics relied heavily on approximately 2.7 million horses for basic transport throughout the entire war. The German army never came close to fully mechanizing despite its fearsome international reputation for armored warfare. Most German infantry divisions marched on foot and hauled their supplies with horse-drawn wagons in exactly the same manner that armies had employed in the previous century and before. Soviet frontline soldiers received far smaller supply allocations than their American counterparts, compensating with lower material expectations and higher tolerance for deprivation. The difference between these approaches was not merely quantitative. It represented entirely different underlying philosophies about how to fight and ultimately win modern wars. The American approach was explicit, deliberate, and institutionally embedded. The stated goal was to substitute steel for flesh at every possible opportunity. When encountering resistance, American units were trained and expected to call in massive artillery bombardments and tactical air support rather than pressing costly infantry attacks against prepared positions. Commanders who expended men instead of ammunition faced professional censure. This doctrine required astronomical quantities of shells and bombs that would have seemed absurd and impossibly wasteful to European military planners accustomed to strict ammunition rationing. American artillery units expended shells at sustained rates that astonished and demoralized German observers, who had grown accustomed to carefully counting every round. During Operation Cobra in late July 1944, American guns fired over 140,000 artillery rounds from more than 1,100 guns to support the breakout from Normandy. This bombardment accompanied a simultaneous aerial assault that dropped over 4,000 tons of bombs. Individual American corps in later operations fired more than 250,000 shells in the span of 2 weeks. During the reduction of the Ruhr pocket in April 1945, American artillery may have fired close to 1 million shells in approximately 2 weeks of concentrated operations. These were quantities of ammunition that Germany's entire industrial base could not have produced in a year of maximum effort. The logistics tail required to sustain this ammunition-intensive approach was necessarily enormous. The American teeth-to-tail ratio was approximately 1 to 4.3. For every combat soldier actually at the front engaging the enemy, more than 4 additional personnel handled supply transport, depot operations, vehicle maintenance, administrative functions, medical support, and countless other essential logistics tasks. German and Soviet armies maintained ratios closer to 1-to-1, or at most 1-to-1.5. This organizational difference meant that roughly 1 million to 1.3 million American soldiers in the European theater performed logistics and support functions rather than direct frontline combat. To German eyes trained in the Prussian tradition of lean military efficiency and aggressive offensive spirit, this massive support structure seemed hopelessly wasteful. But the devastating results on every battlefield spoke for themselves. Consider the remarkable achievement of the Red Ball Express. When American forces dramatically broke out of the Normandy beachhead in August 1944, they advanced so rapidly eastward that they completely outran their carefully planned supply lines. General Patton's Third Army was racing across France faster than the pre-war logistics system had ever been designed to support. The established supply depots and carefully surveyed routes were suddenly hundreds of miles behind the advancing spearheads. The improvised solution became one of the greatest logistical achievements of the entire war. 2 parallel one-way highways were requisitioned and reserved exclusively for military supply convoys. The northern route ran outbound toward the rapidly advancing front lines. The southern route ran inbound for returning empty trucks heading back to the depots for reloading. All civilian traffic was strictly prohibited on these dedicated routes under penalty of military law. Military police controlled every major intersection around the clock to keep convoys moving at maximum sustainable speed. Trucks ran continuously day and night, with headlights blazing despite blackout regulations that applied everywhere else. Over 82 days from late August to mid-November 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered more than 412,000 tons of supplies to advancing American forces. On its single peak day of August 29th, nearly 6,000 vehicles carried over 12,000 tons of cargo in a single 24-hour period. At the operation's height, up to 140 separate truck companies and approximately 23,000 troops participated simultaneously. Approximately 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were African American soldiers serving in segregated units, performing absolutely essential service to the war effort, despite facing persistent discrimination within the very army they served with such distinction. The workhorse vehicle that made this logistical miracle possible was the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck, known affectionately to American soldiers as the Deuce and a Half. American factories produced well over 500,000 of these rugged and remarkably reliable trucks during the war years. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, specifically named the CCKW, one of the 6 most vital pieces of equipment for winning the war in Europe. General George C.W. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, called its smaller but equally important companion the Jeep, America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. American factories produced nearly 650,000 Jeeps during the war. Germany had absolutely nothing comparable to this staggering production capacity and could only watch with a mixture of frustration and professional admiration. The sheer scale of this logistical operation genuinely stunned German commanders who encountered its effects. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of German forces in the West during the Normandy campaign, identified 3 decisive factors that made German defeat absolutely inevitable when interviewed by Allied intelligence officers after the war. First was the unheard-of superiority of Allied air power, which made all movement in daytime completely impossible. Second was the catastrophic lack of motor fuel, so that the panzers and even the Luftwaffe were physically unable to move or fly. Third was the systematic destruction of all railway communications, so that it became impossible to bring a single railroad train across the Rhine River into the combat zone. All 3 of these supposedly military factors were actually consequences of American logistics and industrial capacity, rather than purely tactical or operational considerations. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Germany's most famous and respected commander, stated the fundamental problem with characteristic directness and clarity. Anyone who has to fight even with the most modern weapons against an enemy in complete command of the air fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. Rommel understood with painful clarity. The German army in France was not fighting another army in any traditional sense. It was fighting against an entire industrial civilization that could project overwhelming force at any point it chose to concentrate effort. The most vivid first-hand account of what concentrated American firepower actually felt like on the receiving end came from General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein. He commanded the elite Panzer Lehr division, Germany's best-equipped armoured formation, outfitted with more tanks and vehicles than any other German division in Normandy. On July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra unleashed approximately 3,000 aircraft carrying over 4,000 tons of bombs onto a target area, measuring roughly 6,000 by 2,200 yards. Bayerlein's carefully positioned division lay directly at the center of this concentrated target zone. He later described the bombardment in unforgettable terms that haunted military historians for generations. "The planes kept coming overhead like a conveyor belt," he reported. "The bomb carpets rolled across the landscape one after another without pause. Back and forth the carpets were laid in systematic patterns. Artillery positions were wiped out completely. Tanks were overturned and buried in overlapping craters. Infantry positions were flattened beyond recognition. All roads and tracks were obliterated. By midday, the entire area resembled a moonscape with bomb craters touching rim to rim so closely that it was impossible to distinguish individual impacts. All signal communications had been severed, and no coherent command was possible. The shock effect on the troops was simply indescribable. Several of his men went mad from the sustained bombardment and rushed around in the open completely exposed until they were cut down by bomb splinters. Over 70% of his personnel ended up dead, wounded, psychologically shattered, or too stunned to function as soldiers. This catastrophic result came from a single afternoon of concentrated American firepower. The Panzer Lehr division, Germany's absolute elite armoured formation, equipped with the best tanks and crewed by experienced veterans, was effectively destroyed not in weeks of grinding combat, but in mere hours of systematic bombardment. Bayerlein had previously served as Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa. He had commanded armoured units on the brutal Eastern Front. He knew both theatres intimately from extensive personal experience. The Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944 demonstrated the stark contrast between German and American logistics with brutal and unmistakable clarity. The German offensive through the Ardennes was planned from a position of strategic desperation. Hitler gambled virtually everything on a surprise winter attack that would split Allied forces and capture the vital Belgian port of Antwerp. Success would sever Allied supply lines completely and potentially force a negotiated peace in the West, allowing Germany to transfer forces eastward and concentrate against the Soviets. The plan was operationally audacious. It was also logistically doomed from its very inception. German forces possessed only enough fuel for approximately 6 days of operations and 90 to 100 miles of travel. The distance from their starting positions to Antwerp was 125 miles through difficult terrain. The entire offensive operation explicitly and openly depended on capturing Allied fuel dumps along the route of advance to sustain forward momentum. German planners knew with certainty that their tanks would run completely dry well before reaching the objective unless they successfully seized American supplies. The massive Tiger II tank, Germany's most powerful armored vehicle, mounting an 88mm gun, consumed a staggering 2 American gallons of fuel per mile of travel. This desperate offensive was not merely a military gamble. It was a tacit, institutional admission of total logistical bankruptcy. Kampfgruppe Paper formed the crucial spearhead of the German attack. Commanded by SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, this powerful battle group consisted of approximately 4,800 men, 600 assorted vehicles, including tanks and half-tracks and supply trucks, and around 45 of the formidable Tiger II heavy tanks. Paper received orders to drive fast and penetrate deep into Allied lines, seizing critical bridges and fuel dumps before defenders could react or destroy them. His initial advance was impressively rapid. He successfully captured a small American fuel depot at the Belgian town of Bullingen on December 17th, but quick-thinking American engineers systematically denied Peiper the larger fuel depots he desperately needed. They demolished bridges before German forces could cross them. They drained fuel storage facilities and set fire to what they could not evacuate rather than allow supplies to fall into enemy hands. Determined American combat units delayed Peiper at critical choke points and narrow roads. The route that Peiper's tanks had covered in just 9 hours during the triumphant 1940 invasion of France now required 36 grueling hours of constant combat against stubborn resistance. By December 24th, Peiper's once powerful force was completely stranded in the small village of La Glaise. They were entirely out of fuel. They were nearly out of ammunition. A German air resupply attempt failed completely when approximately 90% of the fuel canisters dropped by parachute, drifted outside their defensive perimeter, and landed in American-held territory. Out of options, Peiper made the painful decision to abandon all vehicles and heavy equipment and attempt escape on foot. Using the darkly ironic password Merry Christmas, approximately 800 men departed La Glaise on foot in the darkness of early December 24th. They marched through freezing forests for 36 exhausting hours without rest. Only 770 men reached German lines at the village of Wanne on Christmas Day. The elite armoured spearhead of Germany's final major offensive had been stopped by logistics failure before American ground forces could truly engage them in sustained armoured combat. Meanwhile, the American response demonstrated everything the Germans had come to fear about their Western enemy. Within 24 hours of the German attack being definitively identified, Eisenhower dispatched 4 full divisions, including the elite 82nd and 101st Airborne as reinforcements. At a crucial commanders' meeting in Verdun on December 19th, General George Patton made an audacious promise that stunned his fellow generals. He would disengage his Third Army from its current offensive operations, pivot the entire massive force 90 degrees northward toward the Ardennes, and begin counterattacking toward the besieged town of Bastogne within 48 hours. The assembled generals were openly skeptical. Staff officers present at the meeting recorded visible shuffling of feet and straightening in chairs when Patton made this seemingly impossible claim. Some faces showed frank disbelief. Moving an entire army corps comprising approximately 60,000 combat troops and well over 130,000 vehicles, more than 100 miles over icy roads in harsh winter conditions, while enemy forces actively blocked and contested the route seemed flatly impossible. No army in recorded military history had successfully executed such a massive maneuver in such an abbreviated time frame under combat conditions. What the skeptical generals did not know was that Patton had already ordered his staff to prepare 3 detailed contingency plans before even arriving at the Verdun meeting. He had correctly anticipated a German attack somewhere and methodically gamed out his potential responses in advance. Combat operations toward Bastogne commenced on December 22nd, within the 48-hour window Patton had confidently promised. His 4th Armoured Division reached the besieged garrison at Bastogne on December 26th, breaking the German encirclement. Patton had delivered on his seemingly impossible operational promise through meticulous advance planning and the logistical capacity to execute complex movements under pressure. The successful aerial resupply of besieged Bastogne provided another stark and instructive contrast between German and American air logistics capabilities. On December 23rd, 241 C-47 transport aircraft dropped desperately needed supplies to the encircled American garrison. The aircraft delivered 144 tons of ammunition, food, and critical medical supplies in just over 4 hours of sustained operations. Over the following 5 days, approximately 700 total aircraft sorties delivered more than 1,100 tons of supplies by parachute and glider. Compare this dramatic success to Germany's catastrophic Stalingrad airlift exactly 2 years earlier. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had personally and loudly promised Hitler to deliver 300 tons of supplies per day to the encircled Sixth Army. Actual deliveries averaged a pathetic 90 tons per day, less than a third of the absolute minimum required to sustain the trapped forces. The Stalingrad airlift failed catastrophically due to inadequate aircraft, poor weather, Soviet fighters, and organizational chaos. It contributed directly to the loss of an entire German army of over 300,000 men. The Bastogne airlift succeeded brilliantly under similarly difficult winter conditions and helped save an encircled American force against overwhelming odds. The fundamental asymmetry was now impossible for any informed German observer to ignore. Germany had launched a major offensive that explicitly depended on capturing enemy supplies because German industry simply could not provide its own forces with adequate logistical support. America responded by successfully airlifting supplies into an encircled position while simultaneously pivoting an entire army corps to counterattack. The Germans thoroughly understood tactical warfare with all its complexities and nuances. The Americans had mastered industrial warfare in its totality. Industrial Warfare 1, the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen in March 1945, provided a final emphatic demonstration of American engineering and logistics supremacy. On March 7th, American forces from the 9th Armored Division discovered to their astonishment that the railroad bridge across the Rhine River had not been completely destroyed as expected. German demolition charges had only partially detonated due to weak civilian-grade explosives substituted for scarce military explosives. The bridge was damaged but passable. American infantry under Sergeant Alex Drabeek rushed across the swaying, damaged structure under German fire and established a small but crucial bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine. The German High Command reacted with horror and fury. Hitler flew into one of his characteristic rages upon receiving the news. The Rhine was supposed to be Germany's final major defensive barrier, the last geographic obstacle that would halt the Allied advance and perhaps force negotiated terms. Now American forces had crossed it without the massive casualties that an opposed river assault would have inflicted. The German military response was ferocious and desperate. The Luftwaffe flew repeated bombing raids against the bridgehead lasting 6.5 hours. 11 V-2 ballistic missiles were fired at the crossing site from launch positions in the Netherlands, marking the only tactical battlefield use of V-2S in the entire war and the only time these weapons struck German soil. Floating mines drifted down the river current toward the bridges. SS Frogmen attempted underwater demolition attacks against the bridge supports. Hitler ordered immediate courts-martial for the officers responsible for defending the bridge. 4 German officers were tried, convicted, and summarily executed for failing to demolish the structure before American capture. A 5th officer was condemned to death in absentia, but was already an American prisoner of war, so the sentence could not be carried out. None of it mattered. When the original battered Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed from accumulated damage on March 17th, American combat engineers already had 4 complete replacement bridges, operational and carrying traffic. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion constructed a 1,032-foot steel treadway bridge in just 32 hours under continuous German artillery fire. Construction ran around the clock from 10:30 on the morning of March 9th to 5:10 on the morning of March 11th without pause. By March 20th, a 1,258-foot floating Bailey Bridge was also complete and operational. Over 125,000 troops from 6 full divisions crossed with all their heavy equipment. American engineering capacity and logistics depth had rendered the Rhine, Germany's last major natural defensive barrier, completely irrelevant to the final outcome of the war. One of the war's deepest and most painful ironies is that American logistics actually powered both of the massive forces that simultaneously crushed Germany from east and west. The Lend Lease program delivered staggering quantities of critical material to the Soviet Union throughout the war years. Over 427,000 military trucks reached Soviet forces, including approximately 152,000 of the rugged Studebaker US-6 trucks. Soviet soldiers grew to rely on these vehicles completely and affectionately, nicknamed them Studers. By 1944, American imported vehicles comprised approximately 70% of the entire Soviet military truck fleet. Soviet offensive capability depended heavily and increasingly on American-manufactured wheels. American Studebaker trucks carried over 20,000 of the famous Katyusha multiple rocket launchers that terrified German troops. The operational mobility that allowed Soviet forces to execute their devastating deep operations and massive encirclements in 1944 and 1945 came largely from American automotive manufacturing. The United States also provided approximately 93% of Soviet wartime railroad equipment procurement, meaning new locomotives and rail cars acquired during the war years. Nearly 2,000 American-built locomotives and over 10,000 freight cars kept Soviet supply lines functioning across the vast distances of the Eastern Front. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin himself acknowledged this critical dependence at the Tehran Conference in 1943. Without American production, he stated to Roosevelt and Churchill, the United Nations could never have won the war. The exact phrasing varies slightly between contemporary accounts since this was an informal dinner toast rather than a prepared statement, but the substance remains consistent across all sources. Nikita Khrushchev later admitted even more bluntly in suppressed memoir passages that were only published in the 1990s. He wrote that without Lend-Lease trucks, Soviet losses would have been colossal because the Red Army would have had no operational maneuverability whatsoever. Khrushchev also recorded that Stalin privately acknowledged during the war that without American help, the Soviet Union would have lost. The eminent military historians David Glantz and Jonathan House reached a similar conclusion through rigorous analysis of Soviet operations. They determined that without American Lend-Lease aid, every major Soviet offensive would have stalled at an earlier stage, outrunning its logistical tail in a matter of days rather than weeks. This means the German soldier fighting desperately on the Eastern Front was already fighting against American logistics even if he had no way to realize it. The trucks that moved Soviet infantry rapidly to breakthrough points were substantially American manufactured. The rail cars that delivered Soviet ammunition to forward depots were frequently American built. The fuel that powered Soviet tanks during their great advances was often American refined. The German soldier who finally faced American forces directly in France or Italy simply encountered the original source of the supply chain that had already been systematically grinding him down from the opposite direction for years. The documentary evidence supports an important historical distinction that German soldiers who experienced combat on both fronts clearly understood and articulated. The Eastern Front was a war against seemingly inexhaustible human reserves willing to accept any level of casualties. Soviet commanders could absorb losses that would have completely shattered any Western army and still continue major offensive operations the following week. The Western Front was fundamentally a material Schlacht, a material battle, against an industrial machine that operated by entirely different rules and assumptions. The Soviets were an enemy who could be outfought tactically, but simply could not be outproduced in human terms. German tactical superiority persisted measurably throughout the entire war from first day to last. In 1941 and 42, the casualty exchange ratio reached approximately 32 Soviet losses for every 10 German. By 1943 through 45, significant Soviet military reforms and hard-won combat experience had narrowed this ratio to approximately 14 Soviet casualties per 10 German. But the Soviets could sustain even the earlier terrible ratios through their enormous population and total mobilization. Their demographic capacity simply exceeded Germany's physical ability to kill Soviet soldiers faster than Moscow could replace them. The Americans represented an entirely different kind of impossible challenge. They were an enemy who could occasionally be matched or even bested in individual tactical engagements, but never in sustained operations over time. German forces frequently inflicted casualties at rates perhaps 50% higher than they suffered in particular battles. This consistent tactical edge proved strategically meaningless because America could replace every loss virtually instantly while Germany could not replace anything at all. A German battalion that successfully destroyed an American battalion in combat had won nothing of lasting value. Tomorrow there would be another complete American battalion with full ammunition loads, factory-fresh vehicle replacements, and rested troops ready to resume the attack. The deepest and most enduring lesson from this history concerns the fundamental nature of modern industrial warfare. By 1944, major armed conflict had evolved decisively beyond what purely military calculation and tactical excellence could hope to address. Economic production capacity, comprehensive industrial mobilization, and robust logistical infrastructure had become the truly decisive factors. Raw combat power mattered, but only within the larger context of what sustainment systems could support and replace. Germany produced magnificent individual weapons that represented the absolute pinnacle of contemporary engineering achievement. The Tiger tank could reliably destroy any Allied armor at ranges where enemy guns could not penetrate its thick frontal armor. The revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter was decades ahead of any Allied aircraft in speed and could have swept the skies clear of enemy planes. The V-2 rocket was the world's first true ballistic missile and the direct technological ancestor of all modern space launch vehicles. None of these wonder weapons mattered strategically because Germany could not produce them in sufficient quantities or keep them supplied with fuel and ammunition. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in Italy and later in the West, captured the experience of leading German armies against American forces in the war's final years. He compared the experience to playing a Beethoven sonata on an old, rickety, and hopelessly out-of-tune piano. The musical score was brilliant, the intended execution was flawless in concept, but the actual performance was impossible because the instrument itself was broken beyond any possible repair. German officers knew exactly what needed to be done tactically and operationally. They simply lacked the material means to accomplish any of it against an enemy who seemed to possess unlimited resources. American factories produced over 2 million military trucks during the war. German forces remained dependent on 2.7 million horses that required fodder and could not be manufactured on assembly lines. American shipyards launched mass-produced Liberty cargo ships at the rate of 3 vessels per day at peak production. At war's start, these ships required over 200 days to build. By war's end, American shipyards had reduced construction time to just 42 days through revolutionary prefabrication techniques. German U-boats could not sink merchant ships faster than American yards built replacements. American aircraft factories turned out over 300,000 planes during the war, roughly 2/3 of all Allied aircraft production. Germany produced approximately 119,000 aircraft, and persistent fuel shortages meant many German aircraft sat grounded, even when mechanically intact and crewed by trained pilots. The United States alone produced more than 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition during the war years. American factories manufactured approximately 86,000 tanks and armored fighting vehicles. The sheer scale of production defied traditional military calculation. 7.7 million German soldiers surrendered to Western Allied forces in the war's final chaotic months. Only approximately 3 million surrendered to the Soviets despite the Eastern Front containing the vast majority of German forces. Many German units fought specifically and desperately to reach American or British lines rather than face Soviet captivity. They ran from Soviet numbers toward American abundance. They chose captivity under the logistics masters over near certain death, under forces that had learned to fight with seemingly inexhaustible human reserves and brutal indifference to prisoner welfare. In making this choice, German soldiers rendered their final professional verdict on which enemy they truly could not defeat. It was not the enemy with more men. The Soviets certainly had more men, But German tactical skill could still inflict terrible casualties on them in every engagement. It was not the enemy with better weapons. German weapons were frequently superior to anything their opponents fielded in direct comparison. It was the enemy with more of everything else: more trucks, more ammunition, more fuel, more replacement parts, more food, more medical supplies, more of every component that sustained modern industrial military operations indefinitely. The Americans had mastered something that completely transcended traditional military thinking and centuries of accumulated strategic wisdom. They had transformed warfare into an engineering and production problem. The solution was overwhelming material abundance applied systematically and relentlessly to every operational requirement, regardless of cost. Against such a comprehensive industrial approach, individual courage and professional skill became insufficient for achieving victory. Only surrender remained as a rational response to an enemy who could pile up supplies faster than you could possibly destroy them. If this video helped you understand one of military history's most important and enduring strategic contrasts, please subscribe to support more documentary content like this. The story of how industrial power ultimately defeated tactical excellence contains lessons that extend far beyond the Second World War and remain directly relevant to understanding modern conflict today. The German soldiers who chose American captivity over continued fighting understood something essential about modern warfare. Victory goes not to the side with the best soldiers or even the best weapons. Victory goes to the side that can sustain operations longer, replace losses faster, and project overwhelming force wherever it chooses. That was the lesson of 1945, and it remains the fundamental reality of industrial age warfare today.